The world had never seen anything like it, until a narrow Afghan valley turned back the very force that had seemed unstoppable. 15,000 people, mostly refugees, grieving survivors of razed cities, stood between a preyed-upon prince and the Mongol machine. For one fierce day the Mongols bled and broke. For one day the legend of invincibility frayed. This is not the story of an empire's collapse. It is the story of a wound so loud that Genghis Khan himself set aside distance, custom, and the terrible calculus of conquest to pursue a single man. Call it an epic reversal, a symbolic downfall, not the undoing of the Khan, but a moment that forced him to act with a fury and a focus usually reserved for kings and gods. If this kind of deep-dive history interests you, hit like and subscribe. There's more on forgotten battles and the strategies that changed the medieval world. Autumn of 1218 begins the chain that will carry us to that valley. The Khwarezmian realm, stretched across the fertile belt of Transoxiana, fed by Silk Road trade and civic wealth, was at its height. Cities like Bukhara and Samarkand glittered with scholars, craftsmen and caravans laden with silk, spices and coin. Shah Muhammad II ruled this patchwork of duchies and cities with a mixture of expansionist pride and brittle arrogance. To the south and east, the Mongol Confederation under Temujin, known to history as Genghis Khan, was gathering itself into a war-making organism like no previous polity. Mobile, ruthlessly organized, and relentless in pursuit. The spark that set the campaign ablaze was petty in its cruelty and colossal in its consequences. A Mongol trade caravan, traveling under the protection that Genghis expected his envoys to receive, was attacked. Merchants were beaten or killed. When Genghis sent envoys to seek redress, the Shah's court did not merely refuse. Some accounts report an outright execution and a humiliating insult to Mongol status. Bearded envoys were reported to have been humiliated, their beards shaved, and others mutilated or killed, according to chroniclers. Contemporary Persian chroniclers, al-Nasawi among them, recorded the outrage in tones that, even centuries later, read as a casus belli. The diplomatic language of the steppe had been trampled. To Genghis Khan, such offences were intolerable, because the empire he was building ran on two intertwined currencies, fear and law. Envoys were sacrosanct. Trade caravans were protected by the Khan's guarantees. To see those guarantees ignored was to invite annihilation. What followed between 1219 and 1221 was a methodical campaign of annihilation that used every instrument in the Mongol arsenal: lightning marches that unhinged defenders, siegecraft that turned cities into false fortresses, and psychological warfare that turned surrender into an instrument of terror. The Mongol war machine was not a single thing one could point to. It was a system of logistics, organization, and battlefield psychology. Bands of mounted archers moved in disciplined units called tumens and mingans, each with internal hierarchy, strict discipline, and an ability to live off the land or carry supplies where necessary. Horses bred for endurance multiplied the speed of campaigns. Spare horses carried the momentum forward. Communication came by riders who leapfrogged along relay networks. Commanders like Jebe, Subutai, and other capable generals were more than raiders. They were operational thinkers who choreographed feints, encirclements, and sieges. When the Mongols arrived before a city, their reputation preceded them. Banners and messengers spread news, often exaggerated, of what awaited those who resisted. Those reputations were weapons. Sometimes a city surrendered at sight, sparing itself, but in cases of resistance, the Mongols perfected a brutal calculus. Reduce the power of centers of resistance utterly, so that future foes would surrender rather than risk their fate. Bukhara and Samarkand are names that sit heavy in the memory of this campaign. Bukhara fell after a swift siege. Its defenders were overwhelmed not only by the Mongols' mobility, but also by engineered terror. Stories of massacres and mass enslavement spread, deliberate and precise in their effect. Samarkand, whose walls had stood through centuries, also fell. Its loss stunned the region and sent ripples of panic into the interior. Sources vary on exact sequences and casualties. Chroniclers, writing from different vantage points, do not always agree. But the pattern is clear. A systematic dismantling of the Khwarezmian state apparatus, followed by the flight of Shah Muhammad II. His flight was not merely political retreat, it was personal and catastrophic. The Shah fled west and then south, pursued by Mongol detachments. Accounts differ about his exact end. Some portray him dying on the run, ill and without the power he once had. Others suggest capture by local rivals and a death removed from the pomp of kingship. The fact of his disappearance from the stage, however, is well attested. What remained after the Shah's collapse was a landscape of displaced people, soldiers without commanders, families burnt from their homes, and entire towns emptied onto the roads. From this ruin rose a figure who would come to embody both desperation and defiance: Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu. Jalal ad-Din is a study in contrasts. He inherited not only a title but an impossible situation, a realm under assault, a father's defeat, and a population scattering under the shadow of Mongol cavalry. Accounts of his early life vary. He emerges in the chronicles as a young prince hardened by catastrophe and quick to seize the levers of survival. Sources such as al-Nasawi depict him as bold, sometimes reckless, yet deeply committed to preserving what remained of his people. Where Shah Muhammad had chosen the honors of kingship and the calculations of court, Jalal ad-Din stepped into the dust and the roadways, leading refugees and assembling the remnants into something with spine. He assembled a force that was not a conventional army by the standards of contemporaneous states. The composition was heterogeneous: remnants of Khwarezmian cavalry, local Afghan tribal levies, Turkic horsemen who had not yet submitted, and a multitude of non-combatants, families, artisans, and others whose survival depended on the protection Jalal ad-Din could provide. Contemporary sources suggest a number often repeated in later retellings. Roughly 15,000 people, fighters and refugees, banded together in the lead-up to the Valley engagement. Exact counts are, as always, debated. Chroniclers offer different tallies, and some later historians have revised the totals. But the point is tactical and moral rather than numeric. This was a force forged from the living remains of an empire. Faced with the Mongols' strengths, speed, feigned retreat, and superior mobility, Jalal ad-Din made choices that would turn the analysis of the battle into a classic study of terrain, psychology, and adaptation. He did not seek open-step engagements where Mongol cavalry, archery, and maneuver would decide the day. Instead, he chose ground that could blunt mobility. The Parwan Valley, a constricted amphitheater of ridges and rivers where an advance could be choked, and the Mongol habit of enveloping movements could be turned against them. Parwan, spelled variously in medieval chronicles as Parwan, Paran, or Parwan, in later translations, was a narrow, river-fed valley with banks that rose into ridged hills on either side. In plain terms, it was a place where cavalry could not simply sweep wide and roll over a line. Control of the high ground, choke points along the riverine bottom, and routes of approach would matter more than numbers alone. Jalal ad-Din made another tactical decision, as consequential as the choice of battlefield. He ordered significant portions of his cavalry to fight dismounted. This was not cowardice, it was adaptation. Dismounted horsemen could hold a line against arrows, decrease the advantage of step mobility, and create a stable front that blended with relieved infantry. Behind that front, he concealed heavy cavalry reserves, the type of shock force that could, when released at the right instant, wrench a collapsing enemy from cohesion into rout. Those hidden reserves were the gamble. To win, Jalal ad-Din would need not merely to hold, but to break the Mongol proclivity for coordinated rotation. those small, relentless harassments by mounted archers designed to wear down, disrupt, and create opportunity. Mongol commanders used feigned retreats as one of their most feared maneuvers, simulate withdrawal, draw the enemy into a disorderly pursuit, and then counter-strike with fresh masses. Jalal ad-Din's order to stay in position and refuse pursuit was a direct rejection of that psychological game. It required discipline among troops who had been living under terror and flight. It demanded trust in commanders and a steadiness that ordinary refugees might not have had. That trust, in the end, would be as decisive as any tactic on the field. Facing Jalal ad-Din at Parwan was a veteran Mongol detachment under the command of Shigi Kutuku, rendered in some sources as Shigi Kutuk, an adopted son figure of Genghis and one of the Khan's trusted lieutenants. Shigi Kutuku was not merely a battlefield leader, he was a symbol of Mongol administrative integration, a man representing the Khan's will. His force, likely comprised of experienced cavalrymen, moved with the assurance that had carried Mongol banners through Samarkand and beyond. For the Mongols, this engagement was meant to be a decisive blow to any remaining organized resistance. For Jalal ad-Din, it was existential. Before the combat erupted, both sides took measure of the other. Mongol tactics at this point typically favored probe and feint. Send forward mounted archers in rotating ranks to fire, retreat, and tire. This was a machine designed to erode morale. On the other side, Jalal ad-Din's line held. He planted his remnants as a fixed bulwark and prevented the natural inclinations of cavalrymen to chase. The valley's walls narrowed the battlefield's geometry. Where open plains rewarded flanking, the amphitheater at Parwan offered cover for a defense and danger for anyone trapped inside. Contemporary chroniclers, writing with varying degrees of embittered patriotism or detached observation, note the odor of desperation in the air. They note, too, moments of fierce leadership. Men planted on walls, banners fluttering, commanders moving among their troops. If one were to step back and make a tactical aside, the mechanics of what Jalal ad-Din attempted are a masterclass in asymmetric adaptation. The Mongol system favored mobility and the exploitation of pursuit. It was a system that assumed the enemy would break when pressured repeatedly and then chased. Jalal ad-Din inverted the assumption. By forcing a protracted positional engagement, he stripped the Mongols of a central tool, the open field chase. He accepted an endurance test in exchange for a chance to deliver a concentrated shock counterpunch. That counterpunch had to come in coordination. Hidden cavalry needed to reveal themselves at precisely the moment Mongol cohesion faltered. Timing, terrain, and discipline would together make or break the plan. On the day itself, the fight began, the way many Mongol engagements did, with a storm of arrows. Mounted archers advancing in ranks kept up a rotating pressure that attempted to thin the defenders' lines and provoke an impulsive reaction. The noise of these skyward volleys, arrows whispering and snapping, has been captured in many later descriptions as an auditory emblem of Mongol warfare. The defenders dug in, answered with their own missile fire where possible, and closed ranks. For hours, the valley tasted of iron and dust. The cadence of attack and return shifted like tides against stone. Then came probing assaults. Smaller, sharper cavalry strokes meant to test weaknesses and force reserves forward. These probes were the Mongol way of identifying a seam, a point where a flank might be turned, where a retreat could be baited, where reserve placement could be exploited. Jalal ad-Din's men stiffened. His order to dismount became its own kind of morale anchor. Men without the visceral option to flee were forced to stay and fight as a coherent mass. The Mongols, surprised at the refusal to pursue, adjusted, sending heavier formations forward. For archival chroniclers, the drama is palpable. The steppe lords had expected a rout. Instead, they met a line unyielding in the face of their usual gambits. As afternoon lengthened, leadership mattered more than ever. Jalal ad-Din was present on the field. Sources emphasize his visible courage and hands-on direction. Mongol commanders likewise directed their units with practiced detachment, using rotation to preserve force while seeking opportunity. Casualties mounted on both sides, though precise numbers are difficult to confirm, and chroniclers' accounts should be read for bias and tone rather than arithmetic. What is clear is the psychological arc of the day. What began as a test became a grinding contest of wills. There is one chronicler's image that recurs: the valley acting like a throat, narrowing movement and intensifying impact. When a fighting force is compressed, cohesion becomes both easier to sustain and easier to shatter. The Mongols' typical advantage, room to wheel and use massed rates of fire, was denied. The defenders' stake, hold at all cost, was amplified. Each failed probe cost horses and men. Each failed rotation strained the Mongol command structure. Meanwhile, Jalal ad-Din held his reserves, refusing premature commitment. Discipline, under such pressure, is rarer than courage. The men who held the line were not simply soldiers. Many were people who had watched their homes burn and had no option but to stay. That mixture of rage, grief, and determination gave the line an unusual moral ballast. And then, according to multiple chroniclers, though with differing details, the day pivoted on a moment of explosive violence, a coordinated counterstroke that struck the Mongol flanks at a time when their formation had thinned. Some accounts emphasize that the heavy cavalry, once hidden, thundered out of concealment to smash into the Mongol wings. Others stress that the Mongols' cohesion, already eroded by extended fighting in cramped terrain, finally sheared, and the result was a rout. Chroniclers differ on whether the push was perfectly timed or seized, because the Mongol force simply tired. What is significant is that Mongol units, hitherto masters of maneuver, found themselves in disarray inside a valley that offered no easy avenue for regrouping. The rout that followed was not a clean picture of annihilation, but a chaotic collapse. Horses bolted, banners were lost, and the carefully drilled rotations that had made the Mongols formidable dissolved into a scramble. Those who could fled the field, many could not. Sources report heavy Mongol losses in the immediate aftermath. Historians caution that numbers vary and precise tallies are unreliable. It is safer and truer to speak of a decisive tactical blow, a veteran Mongol detachment broken and a reputation punctured. News of what had happened at Parwan reached Genghis Khan like a personal insult. The Khan had been occupied elsewhere, but the failure of a trusted lieutenant, one bearing the Khan's name and authority, to subdue a remnant force, enraged him. Contemporary chroniclers say Genghis did not delegate this matter. He took it personally. Whether this is poetic flourish or a straightforward report is debated among historians. What is undeniable is the subsequent action. Genghis gathered a fresh, larger force and set out in pursuit. The campaign's moral geometry had shifted. No longer was it merely conquest, it had become personal retribution. For Jalal ad-Din and his followers, the victory was both salvation and provocation. It bought them breathing room and an aura of invincibility for a short while. It also drew Genghis's concentrated attention. The refugees who had become soldiers now faced the terrifying prospect of a relentless pursuit across hostile terrain toward the Indus River, a crossing that would test the limits of endurance and martial cunning. The route toward the Indus is a story of desperation, mountain passes that tightened into traps, bitter winter that chilled men and horses, and rearguard actions that read like small epics of sacrifice. Chronicles record instances where Jalal ad-Din's rearguards held crossings long enough for convoys to pass or turned to buy hours with their lives, dramatic, tragic, and often rendered in stylized language by scribes who sought moral patterns in chaos. Whether every detail in those accounts is literal, truth is uncertain. What is clear is the pattern of a pursued force, attempting to leverage terrain and to buy time. At one critical juncture near the Indus, with the great river roaring and tributaries swollen by seasonal waters, the refugees found themselves with water behind them and Mongol blades before them. In a scene retold in many sources, Jalal ad-Din, realizing that staying meant annihilation, mounted his steed and, with what appears to have been an act both desperate and audacious, leapt into the torrent to escape. Some chroniclers describe him swimming, others a horse plunge, followed by a scramble ashore. The detail that survives most consistently is not the exact choreography, but the symbolic image, a prince plunging through a river to save his life and, for a moment, his cause. Genghis Khan, watching from the opposite bank or nearby vantage points, depending on which account one reads, is said to have looked on with a complex expression. Anger, frustration, but also an unusual admixture of admiration. Some sources say he remarked on Jalal ad-Din's courage, a rare compliment from a man who prized strength above all. Others interpret the observation as mere curiosity, the skill of a worthy adversary noted before a hunter rekindled his pursuit. Again, historians urge caution. Chroniclers often shape episodes to moral or dramaturgic ends. Whether Genghis truly felt admiration, or whether later storytellers projected that admiration as a literary flourish, is hard to determine. What remains indisputable is the effect. The Mongol pursuit did not end at Parwan. It intensified. By the time Jalal ad-Din reached the relative safety of the Indian plains, he carried with him a reputation born of both victory and flight. He would go on to forge ephemeral bases of power in the subcontinent and to contest Persian territories again. But the momentum of a united Khwarezmian polity had been shattered. The story of Parwan, however, is more than the fate of a prince. It became a lesson in military adaptation, that the Mongols, for all their advantages, could be countered when the enemy chose ground, refused to be baited, and disciplined their responses. That lesson would echo decades later in other battles where steppe tactics met prepared defenses and shock cavalry in equal measure. Yet even as Parwan offered a tactical template, it left open long strategic questions. Could a single valley's triumph change the course of a sprawling conquest? Could the victory of refugees become the scaffold of a durable state? The answers were not simply military, they were political and logistical. The Mongol system was resilient, capable of replenishing losses and refocusing efforts. Genghis Khan's personal response, assembling a larger force and turning the campaign into an obsession, demonstrated that symbolic wounds could prompt brutal remedies. As winter slackened and the Mongol pursuit pressed on, accounts diverge on many specifics. Some chroniclers emphasize the scale of Mongol retribution that followed in the wake of Parwan, while others focus on Jalal ad-Din's narrow escapes and the human toll on refugees. The historical record is a field of fragments, court histories, eyewitness reports, and later compilations, all layered and colored by their authors' aims. In weighing them, we must be conscious of both what they reveal and what they conceal, motives, biases, and gaps in information that leaves certain details indefinite. Yet within the uncertainty, patterns bind together, pride provoking conflict, adaptable leadership arising from disaster, terrain bending the arc of battle. There is, finally, a moral that contemporary chroniclers were keen to underline. Power is not absolute, and reputation can be fragile. The Mongol reputation for invincibility had been bruised at Parwan. It did not shatter, but it was no longer the unassailable myth it had been a year earlier. That bruise mattered because political control often depends as much on perception as on force. Rivals, subjects, and distant powers watched to see whether an empire could still meet imperial law or whether opportunity presented itself in the sound of splintering banners. The scene we leave now is one of men and horses gathering themselves for the next march, of a prince who has tasted both victory and the need to flee, of a Khan whose anger is a furnace, drawing tighter the circle around a single adversary. The valley at Parwan will stand as a memorial to a single day when refugees became soldiers and when the Mongol machine stumbled. But the story is barely halfway told. The pursuit that follows, the desperate crossing of the Indus, and Genghis Khan's personal campaign to punish and to vindicate his name, all demand attention. What follows will test whether a tactical triumph can become strategic salvation, and whether a symbolic wound can force an empire to reveal its limits. The scene we left was not one of resolution, but of relentless motion. Men and horses gathering themselves for the next march. A prince who had tasted both triumph and flight, and a Khan whose anger burned brighter for being wounded in pride. What followed was a campaign turned from conquest into a personal vendetta, a pursuit that would test stamina, command, and the limits of what terrain and human will could endure. Genghis Khan, who had spent years constructing a machine of war out of speed and discipline, now redirected its gears toward a single objective. He marshaled fresh forces, called in contingents that had been spread across the campaign, and moved with a swiftness that was the Mongol specialty. According to later Persian chroniclers, who write with varying degrees of access and agenda, this was not merely a punitive raid, but an obsession. He demanded the recovery of his honor as much as the crushing of resistance. Whether one reads those chronicles as straightforward reportage or as the later shaping of myth, the effect on contemporaries was immediate. The victory at Parwan had brought air, but it had also invited the concentrated wrath of the Khan. The retreat itself was a study in desperate logistics. A force that had won a field could not assume it had secure lines of supply. The Mongols pursued with detachments that harried flanks, seized crossings, and attempted to interdict wagons and refugees. Mountain passes, ordinarily a blessing for those fleeing lowland cavalry, could be deadly when snow narrowed trails and exposed convoys to ambush or collapse. Chronicles, Al-Nasawi among them, paint rearguard actions in heroic colors, small units holding bridges against superior numbers, commanders sacrificing men to buy hours for women, children, and wounded to pass. These accounts, rendered in the cogent moralizing prose of court historians, underline the human cost without pretending to a full accounting. Sources vary on precise sequences and losses, but they agree on pattern, sacrifice for passage, exhaustion, and the inexorable narrowing of options as the Indus approached. The Indus crossing is the episode that most chronicle writers choose to dramatize. Rivers in medieval warfare are both barrier and deadline. A swollen current can cut an army off, turning retreat into trap. When Jalal ad-Din's column reached the Indus, some accounts describe a scene of terrible urgency. Boats scuttled or seized, fords clogged with desperate animals and wagons, and the roar of the river drowning out entire conversations. Others emphasize a series of tactical missteps that allowed Mongol detachments to strike while the crossing was incomplete. The one consistent image across sources is the prince mounted on a horse at the water's edge, and then, seeing no viable alternative, riding down into the torrent. Paraphrasing Juvaini and later compilers like Rashid al-Din, chroniclers report that Jalal ad-Din's leap was at once a practical escape and an emblematic act. Whether he swam a horse across a deep river or performed an audacious plunge that gave his men a focal point for withdrawal, the fact remains that the crossing broke the immediate encirclement. The rearguard, however, paid a severe price. Numerous chroniclers, writing from Persian, Arabic, or Turkic milieus, recorded scenes of slaughter, capture, and the scattering of those who could not make the jump. Again, the details diverge. What is consistent is the human rhythm: refuge, delay, sacrifice, and survival by a narrow margin. One image in particular has been repeated and reshaped by successive chroniclers and storytellers: a prince riding into a river, the horse fighting the current, banners trailing like wet reeds. Some later accounts suggest that Genghis himself paused to watch the spectacle, and that the Khan, moved by the sight of such daring, offered a grudging compliment. If one reads the chroniclers carefully, the compliment is both historically plausible and narratively tempting. Genghis admired courage and valued skill. To praise an opponent who displayed both would be consistent with his recorded character. Yet the temptation to moralize or to turn the moment into a parable of respect must be resisted. The sources, sparse and colored by the aims of court historians, cannot sustain too literal a reading. Still, the anecdote endures because it captures a truth beyond the factual. Even amid annihilating force, individual acts of courage can become the touchstones of memory. What happened after the crossing is a tale of dispersal and ephemeral revival. Jalal ad-Din did not disappear from history after the Indus. He re-emerged intermittently as a thorn in Mongol sides. He took refuge among diverse polities, made alliances where he could, and briefly carved out power in parts of northwestern India and later in western Persia. His campaigns were characterized less by territorial consolidation than by rapid strikes, opportunistic alliances, and constant movement, an echo of the very mobile warfare that had once undone him. Chroniclers record, for example, his attempt to seize Herat and his skill in forging temporary coalitions with local rulers. But the structural advantages he had once hoped to assemble, coherent administration, sustained supply lines, and a loyal base of manpower, were never fully realized. The Khwarezmian state had been shattered. The social bonds and institutional scaffolding necessary for recovery had been broken or dispersed. Jalal ad-Din's end is subject to the usual medieval uncertainties. Sources point toward a death in exile around 1231 in most chronicle traditions, but the precise circumstances are debated. Some accounts suggest assassination during a skirmish with local rivals in the region of Ganja. Others imply a death in more ambiguous circumstances while traveling through hostile territory. Wherever the truth lies, the point for our narrative is structural. The prince who had once commanded the loyalty of thousands and secured a dramatic victory at Parwan had not, in the end, established durable sovereignty. The victory at Parwan bought a breathing space, a story of courage and a reputation that haunted the Mongol psyche. It did not, however, rebuild the Khwarezmian realm into its earlier shape. This juxtaposition, the tactical genius of a single battle and the strategic insufficiency to translate that victory into political longevity, raises a set of broader questions about medieval warfare. How much could a battlefield triumph change the course of empires? The answer must be calibrated. A single victory can alter perception, buy time, and inspire imitators. It can also draw down reprisals and invite the concentrated attention of enemies with deeper reserves. Parwan did the first two and risked the second. Genghis Khan's reaction, his personal pursuit, intensified campaigns, and reallocation of strategic resources demonstrates that symbolic wounds could trigger practical remedies. If Parwan left a bruise on the Mongol reputation, it also left a set of tactical lessons that would resonate across decades. To make those lessons clear, it helps to step out of narrative and into analysis. Why, in operational terms, did a veteran Mongol force stumble in a valley against a force that, by many measures, looked like refugees rather than a conventional army? Several interlocking factors explain the outcome. First, terrain changed the operational equation. Mongol warfare excelled on open ground, where mounted archers could execute rotation, enfilade, and pursuit. Narrow valleys negate those options. In the amphitheater of Parwan, flanks were constrained, lines could not be easily turned, and the space required for disciplined, feigned retreats was limited. The geography compressed the Mongol options and amplified the defenders' ability to hold. Second, Dismounted defense was a radical but effective adaptation. By ordering cavalry to fight on foot, Jalal ad-Din created a contiguous, less vulnerable front. Dismounted horsemen could form shielded ranks, resist momentum attacks, and anchor positions against which Mongol light cavalry tactics had reduced efficacy. Dismounted defense is not new to history, but its deliberate use here against a predominantly steppe opponent demonstrates a conscious tactical inversion. Third, the concealment and timely commitment of heavy cavalry provided the decisive hammer. The Mongol system had great advantages in mobility, but could be denied the space to realize them. By holding shock forces in reserve and releasing them when the enemy was strained, Jalal ad-Din replicated a classical combined arms approach: missile attrition to wear the enemy, followed by shock to shatter cohesion. Fourth, discipline and restraint under psychological pressure were crucial. The Mongol feigned retreat is as much a psychological weapon as a maneuver. A force that pursues without cohesion loses command control. Jalal ad-Din's insistence on holding the line neutralized that weapon. The defender's ability to resist the urge to chase, a hard thing for any cavalry culture, reflects training, command clarity, and a grim recognition that flight meant annihilation. Fifth, command and leadership matter in the small. The presence of Jalal ad-Din on the field, moving among troops, directing reserves, and visibly sharing risk, provided a focal point that buoyed morale. Chroniclers emphasize such personal leadership in medieval battles because, in an age without instant communications or rigid staff systems, leadership at the moment often determined the outcome. These elements, when combined, form the anatomy of Parwan's victory: denial of space, alteration of standard mode, dismounted defense, judicious use of reserves, and psychological discipline. Historians and tacticians have long used Parwan as a case study in how improvised forces can beat superior tactical systems by changing the terms of engagement. The lesson is not purely romantic, it is practical. Choose the ground, change the rules, and strike when the enemy's advantages are neutralized. Yet Parwan was not a universal corrective to Mongol methods. The Mongol war machine had institutional flexibility. It could absorb losses, reinforce, and alter operational patterns. This resilience is visible in what followed: the intensified pursuit, the relentless pressure, and the eventual dispersal of Jalal ad-Din's hopes. A single battle broke a detachment and punctured a reputation, but it did not break the Khan's capacity to marshal forces across vast distances and rebuild momentum. It is in that dialectic, temporary tactical triumph versus enduring strategic power that Parwan's real historical significance lies. The victory informed later commanders and offered a tactical template, but it also illuminated the limits of battlefield glory in the face of superior resources and organizational depth. Those later resonances are perhaps most often read through the lens of Ain Jalut, fought nearly half a century later in 1260, where Mamluk forces halted a Mongol advance into Egypt and the Levant. Historians have drawn connections between Parwan and Ain Jalut, not as direct lines of transmission, but as thematic echoes. At Ain Jalut, the Mamluks used a mixture of prepared terrain, heavy cavalry shock, and disciplined restraint against Mongol light cavalry, elements recognizable from Parwan's countermeasures. Whether Ain Jalut's planners consulted Parwan directly in tactical manuals, or whether the parallels are a convergence of common military sense in confronting steppe tactics is debatable. What matters is that both battles demonstrate a recurring possibility. When opposing forces shape the battlefield proactively and combine missile attrition with shock action, Mongol light cavalry dominance can be challenged. Ain Jalut, moreover, had a different strategic context. The Ilkhanate and the Mamluk Sultanate were settled polities capable of sustained political responses. By 1260, the Mongol juggernaut had also spread across Eurasia in ways that altered logistics, command, and the distribution of forces. Parwan, by contrast, was a localized resistance in the midst of an already assembled Mongol offensive. Its victory offered tactical insight, but not the durable institutions to exploit it. The comparison is therefore instructive and sobering. Tactical lessons can be learned quickly, but turning them into a strategic defense requires political coherence and material depth. Beyond formal military analysis, Parwan's symbolic weight persisted in chronicles and oral memory. For Persian and Afghan writers of the later Middle Ages, the image of refugees who fought in a valley and inflicted a bruise on an empire that had seemed unstoppable became a moral touchstone. It offered a narrative in which local courage could briefly outshine distant might. For Mongol chroniclers and their patrons, the episode became a test of response. How would the Khan repair honor and deterrence after such a setback? The answer: deploy overwhelming force, pursue relentlessly, and punish transgressors of Mongol mandates, was characteristic of Genghis's mixture of fury and calculation. There is another angle to consider: refugees as agents of history. The conventional image of refugees is of passive victims swept by events. Parwan complicates that picture. The people who fled Bukhara and Samarkand did not simply disappear into anonymity. At Parwan, many of them became the very instrument of resistance. Their motives were not purely martial. Survival, the protection of family, and a thirst for revenge all played roles. But their transformation from displaced civilians into fighting formations is a reminder that catastrophic dislocation can generate new political and military dynamics. That is a lesson with echoes beyond medieval Central Asia. Social dislocation can rearrange power structures when combined with charismatic leadership and tactical opportunity. As the decades swept on, the story of Parwan became both specific and universal. It was specific in its cast of characters: Jalal ad-Din's audacity, Shigi Kutuk's defeat, Shigi Kutuk in some transliterations, and Genghis Khan's personal response, and universal in its themes: pride humbled, adaptation rewarded, and the fragility of even the most celebrated reputations. For military historians, Parwan remains a cautionary case about assuming the permanence of tactical dominance. For general readers, it is a human drama about refugees who fought not for nation-states, an anachronistic concept in the 12th and 13th centuries, but for survival, honor, and the chance to live under someone's law. The later life of Jalal ad-Din demands a closer biographical lens because it shows what victory at Parwan could and could not produce. Born into a ruling family that had controlled a multi-ethnic realm, he possessed qualities that made him a rallying figure: charisma, martial skill, and the ability to attract men whose loyalties were otherwise fragmented. Yet he also inherited structural weaknesses: the breakdown of administrative networks, the flight of tax bases, and the erosion of inter-elite trust. Over the next decade, he oscillated between striking gains and devastating setbacks. He won battles and then lost them, held cities briefly and then was forced to flee. His attempts to exploit Indian resources and to align with regional potentates illustrate a pragmatic approach. He sought new patronage and new power bases when the old ones had been destroyed. That pragmatism made him adaptable, but also prevented him from being perceived as a legitimate sovereign by many elites who preferred stability to his peripatetic leadership. Jalal ad-Din's death, when it came, closed a chapter without resolving the larger book. He became, in later Persian historiography, both a tragic hero and an emblem of the limits of resistance. Persian panegyrics mourned his courage. Mongol annals recorded him as a notable adversary. Local oral traditions preserved tales of his daring. The ambiguity of his post-Parwan career, victory followed by dispersal, resurgence, and ultimate extinction, mirrors the ambiguous legacy of Parwan itself, a glorious day that did not change the larger arc, but that reverberated far beyond its immediate bounds. What then are the lasting implications of this episode? For the Mongols, Parwan did not topple the Khan. Genghis would continue to consolidate power across Eurasia. He would die in 1227 on campaign, leaving an empire that his successors would expand and carve into Khanates. But Parwan altered the mythic narrative. No longer could the Mongol image as an infallible storm be presented without caveats. Opponents could point to a day when Mongol tactics failed. Potential allies and vassals could interpret such a failure as a sign that resistance might be possible under certain conditions. That shift in perception matters because medieval power rests on both steel and reputation. If the perception of omnipotence wanes, the cost of resistance seems less prohibitive. Genghis's reaction, his personal pursuit, was calculated to blunt that perception and restore a clear forecast of consequence. Defy the Khan, and you will be hunted. For later military thinkers, Parwan became a small case study in adaptation and the limits of mobile warfare. It is one thing to hail the Mongols as a phenomenon of steppe mastery. It is another to recognize that mastery as contingent upon conditions. Specialized tactics, mobility, feigned retreat, rotation are highly effective when the environment suits them. When environment and opponent cancel those advantages, different tactics, dismounted defense, surprise countershock, and terrain denial can produce reversal. Parwan teaches the perennial lesson that no military system thrives without contingency plans, and that even elite formations can be vulnerable when forced into unfavored geometries. Finally, there is a human dimension that must not be overlooked. War stories often focus on generals and movements, but Parwan's core was a population in flight that for a single day refused to be erased. The refugees who became soldiers carried with them the weight of burned towns, of lost kin, of homes turned to ash. When they stood and fought, the battle became more than a clash of arms. It became an assertion to continue existing. To render that aspect in sober, non-sentimental terms, their stakes were existential, and their conduct under pressure was shaped by grief as much as by discipline. As we close this long reckoning with Parwan and its aftermath, we must reconcile the title that brought us here, Genghis Khan's epic downfall, with the truth on the ground. The title is a provocation. It promises a narrative of unmaking. Historically strict readers must be reminded that Parwan was not the fall of Genghis Khan. The Khan retained political supremacy, the Mongol apparatus remained formidable, and the empire's expansion continued in subsequent decades. Yet titles are also metaphors. When read with care, downfall can mean a profound wounding, a symbolic humiliation that required a dramatic response. Parwan was precisely that. A wound to reputation, an occasion that forced the Khan to pursue vengeance personally, and a moment that revealed the Mongol machine as fallible. This calibrated reading, seeing Parwan as a symbolic downfall rather than a political collapse, allows us to keep two truths together. First, the Mongol Empire did not collapse because of Parwan. Second, Parwan mattered because it punctured the illusion of invincibility and demonstrated how resolute, well-disciplined defenders could exploit terrain and timing to blunt a superior force. Both statements are true, and both are essential to understanding the incident's historical aura. There are counterfactuals worth pondering, not to indulge in fantasy, but to test the tightness of history's weave. What if Jalal ad-Din had consolidated his victory by securing a defensible polity, restoring administrative ties, and forging durable alliances? Could his victory have turned into a sustained resurgence? Possibly, but the obstacles were massive. The demographic blow of conquest, the psychological demoralization of displaced elites, and the Mongol propensity for relentless pressure. Conversely, what if Genghis had treated Parwan as an aberration and not a personal affront? Perhaps the Khan would have delegated the hunt and redirected resources elsewhere. Perhaps Jalal ad-Din could have found breathing space to transform a battlefield triumph into political consolidation. These thought experiments help us appreciate contingency. Small choices and a few weeks' momentum can alter the long sweep of fate, but they rarely, on their own, determine it. As our account draws to a close, one last reflection seems fitting. Pahwan stands as a reminder that history's turning points are often messy, never pure, rarely complete. A valley yielded a victory that changed perceptions, but it never altered the deeper structures that propelled empires. The human drama at its heart, refugees who refused to be extinguished, a prince who gambled on terrain and timing, and a Khan who took the insult personally, captures the interplay of courage, tragedy, and power that animates much of medieval history. The valley today is quiet. Stones remain, rivers still find their old courses, and the memory of banners and horsehoofs has long since faded into the soil. Yet in the annals and in the imaginations of those who study war, Pahwan endures as a telling episode, a day when the unstoppable was stopped, if only for a time. A moment when the oppressed rose and struck a blow that echoed beyond the field. If this exploration of Pahwan and its consequences interested you, share this video with someone who loves deep historical narratives and consider subscribing. There are more forgotten battles and the lessons they teach waiting to be told.